You look ahead. There is a secure vault in front of you containing an amazing source of experience, learning, and even some semi-useful facts. It is clear that no one has been in here in a long time as it is overgrown. However, in your hands you hold the combination. Do you dare to enter? Or do you stand there and reflect about the time when you used to know these things? Whilst metaphors for memory are useful, it's hard to reflect the true nature of what actually takes place inside our heads. Why is it that some things stick with us while other things seem to fade away, often forever? There are a series of steps that you can take in being able to access this more regularly and more consistently. Just as having that combination into the vault, you will have the tools to be able to access those key things in your mind. The first step is to have a visual model of the states of knowing, essentially where we are in relation to knowledge itself. By having a look at each of these, we can then pinpoint our location and determine what the next steps are going to be. This can be broken down into 4 main quadrants to do with our learning journey. When we examine each of the rows, we'll see whether we are a holder of knowledge or not. When we examine each of the columns, we'll see whether we have an awareness of knowledge or not. What we are looking at is the combination of each of these, with the ultimate goal of having both the knowledge and the awareness of the knowledge. That's when we can really lean towards understanding and the application of that knowledge. In our quest for quadrant 1, we often think about this coming from a place of not having knowledge to holding knowledge. However, our starting place should always be with the knowledge that we have already. Therefore, we're moving from a place where we are unaware to a place of awareness. Think of it this way. You already have plenty of food in your pantry and your fridge. Before you go out and buy more, you'll take stock of what you have. Therefore, there is an efficiency in this process to start with what you know first, even if it's not already apparent. And because our brains like to work in a linear fashion, we're going to swap these around so that we can see how we can go from a state of being unaware to developing the awareness in our knowledge. Recall is a process that we use to retrieve information from our brains. We usually do this relatively automatically. However, there will be times where we need a more intense focus to be able to do so. Recall sits alongside encoding, often working in a cyclical format which is useful to both reactivate what we know as well as consolidate and strengthen. The challenge comes for the most part is that we use inefficient methods to do this, and this is what we want to change today. Imagine being asked the question, what do you know that you know? It's often one that causes people's minds to go blank. They think about their name, or they think about their age, or they scan the room for their surroundings to see if there's anything they can draw from there, looking for cues, looking for visualizations that are going to help prompt an answer to this. And the challenge actually lies in the breadth of the question. When we make this more specific, it's much easier for our brains to be able to retrieve the information that is relevant. And that's what we want to do wherever possible. The more specific we can be, the easier it is for our brains to be able to respond. Before we head on, it's important to note that some of this lack of awareness is due to forgetting. However, there are going to be aspects that are due to implicit knowledge or intuition. That is, things that we have done so many times before that they've become second nature to us, and we no longer attribute them to our skills and capabilities. This level of automaticity is useful. However, when we're considering what we need for a particular project, we may overlook these, therefore lack the awareness. This is another example of where we don't know what we know. And as another cue for Retrieval, like and subscribe. We'd love to have you along for the journey, particularly as you activate those parts of your brain that have been locked away for far too long. Now, lists provide a strong foothold into the depths of our mind. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about to-do lists, but rather the ones that draw on our previous experiences and learning that are going to be relevant for what lies ahead. Now, there's several reasons that lists are particularly effective. Let's dive in to find out a bit more about them. Whilst there are many reasons that lists can be effective, there are 3 in particular that help us to understand this, such as cognitive load. Lists help our brains to break down key information into smaller digestible chunks. Schema formation. Lists help our brains set a framework to access more knowledge for understanding and application. And cued recall. Each item on the list helps as a cue to retrieve other related items within this. When you have limited time to prepare, having a list of 10 meals that you know you can confidently cook without a recipe will help with that preparation. Or if you want to see how your understanding of the world is determined, then knowing the countries that you have visited or even the locations can help build that context. Or let's say you want to think about moments of success, triumph, or even bitter disappointment. Then defining your top moments on the recreational field will become an important part of that. And finally, you could consider the upcoming tomato growing season and consider what your 7 top tips for a successful plot will be. Each of these will help to define what it is that you're looking at, building on the knowledge that you have already and bringing it to the fore. So there are a couple of things that we need to have an effective list. The first of all is that specific topic. What is our focus going to be? What is it that we're asking our brains to retrieve? The second thing that actually makes a really big difference is the number of items on the list. A simple one would be recall 3 things. The more we stretch the list, the more we need to focus to be able to recall these things. And it's a very effective way of making sure that you build everything that needs to be on there. Now, this is the point where you're going to be going, really? A list? That sounds dry. And when we consider it purely as a list, then it is. However, with each of the items that come onto the list, there's usually a story attached to it, particularly if it is linked to our past experiences. Therefore, when you do recall each of those sporting triumphs or disappointment, you consider the story that exists within that. When you consider about the different locations that you've visited, there is a story to that. And when you think about your achievements and your experiences, there is more there to be accessed. Simply recalling it and bringing it to our awareness is the first step. What you do with it next is entirely what is going to make the difference. But if the knowledge that we're trying to retrieve isn't related to experience and it is simply knowledge that we need to know for something, again we go back to that idea that it provides the framework. From that framework we can expand on what's there. And there is something else that is important in this, the serial position effect. The tendency for us to remember the first parts of information and the last parts and forget the middle. The primacy, the recency, and that forgotten middle. By creating a list, it helps us to identify all of the elements, and particularly those middle ones. The more time we spend recalling those, the greater the likelihood that they are going to stick or come from that place of not being aware to awareness. When you meet someone for the first time, often they will give you their name. Technically, at this point in time, you can say that you know it. However, we know in reality this is often quite different. Some methods such as maintenance rehearsal, where you repeat the name over and over, will help to lock this into short-term memory, but it doesn't go much further than that. Connecting the face to the name starts to take us a step further. However, we can change the interaction to questioning or quizzing. So instead of repeating Steve, Steve, Steve to try and remember their name, what you can do is consider, who have I just met? What was the first conversation that I had with Steve? Where was I when I met Steve for the first time? Each time you do this, you are building that neural pathway and giving yourself the optimal chance of being able to retrieve this name going forward. If we flip back over to our list situation, then we can better see how the quizzing or questioning allows us to delve into more depth with these topics. The whats, the wheres, the whos, the whens, the whys, and the hows are all important ways in which we can extend and recall more about the topics that we need to know. The more that we practice these, the better we will become at identifying those specific skills or the knowledge that is going to be relevant to us moving forward. The key part of this is the practice and being able to use this in a way that is useful to you. Simply asking a question of what are the best ways is different to asking a question of why are these things relevant. Once we have the list, it's expanding the narrative and the story around it. Finding the right question that allows us to dive deeper into what we know and maybe what isn't quite as aware as we'd like it to be. Ultimately, all of these questions will then take you from a place of lack of awareness to awareness, where you are able to confidently see what it is that you already know, and more importantly, how you can use it. Whilst it is definitely effective to have other people quiz us to aid our retrieval, sometimes it's not practical due to other people not being around, or maybe there's a time constraint in place. This is where we can turn to AI, in particular large language models. Large language models are set up in a way that allow us to be able to feed in a prompt and then get a response. We can flip this around, so therefore we're defining a role and having the AI then be the provoker, and we are the responder. Over time, the questions will be refined as you understand the specifics of what you require and the specifics of how this can be prompted. Using AI to prompt us allows us to draw from our own ideas and experiences. We can then align these with our skills and capabilities. In this case, we're using it to enhance the retrieval process, not replace it. And there is an important distinction in that. If we come back to our original quadrant and consider our progression from quadrant 2 to quadrant 1, that place of not being aware to developing that awareness, then these prompts are an important part of that, the cues to be able to recall, to retrieve that information. So in conclusion, as we take you as a holder of knowledge from a place of lack awareness to greater awareness, think about those three things: the list, the quizzing and the questioning, and the creative use of AI. All of that prompting, each of those help us to recall the cues, act towards the retrieval. Use those to your advantage. And most importantly, at the end of this process, you will be able to say that you know what you know.